My name is Commander Marcus Reeves, and I served in naval intelligence for 24 years before what I encountered in the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean forced me into early retirement with an NDA so restrictive that sharing even this much could land me in federal prison for the rest of my life. I'm 61 years old now, living quietly in a small coastal town in Oregon, and I've decided that some truths are too important to keep buried, even if revealing them costs me everything. What we found 36,000 feet below the surface in the Mariana Trench wasn't a sunken vessel or geological formation or any natural phenomenon that existing science could explain. It was a structure, massive and clearly artificial, that had been sitting on the ocean floor for what our best estimates suggested was at least 50,000 years. And inside that structure, we found something that has fundamentally altered my understanding of human history, the origins of civilization, and whether we're actually the first advanced species to inhabit this planet. The discovery began in late 2016 during a routine deep-sea mapping mission using the Navy's newest autonomous submersible drones equipped with synthetic aperture sonar that could penetrate sediment and create detailed three-dimensional maps of the seafloor. We were surveying an unexplored section of the Challenger Deep, the absolute deepest part of the ocean, at nearly 7 miles below the surface, when one of the drones detected an anomaly that didn't match any known geological formation. The sonar readings showed a structure with right angles, perfectly straight edges, and geometric patterns that couldn't possibly be natural. The data was so unexpected that we initially assumed it was equipment malfunction or some kind of interference, but 3 separate drones confirmed the same readings from different angles. There was something down there, something that shouldn't exist according to everything we understood about the history of the ocean floor and human civilization. I was brought into the project because of my security clearance and my background in analyzing potential foreign military installations. The initial assumption was that this might be some kind of secret Chinese or Russian underwater base, though how they would have constructed anything at that depth without us detecting it seemed impossible. We sent down our most advanced deep-sea submersible, the Triton, unmanned and heavily equipped with cameras and sensors to get visual confirmation of what the sonar was detecting. What it recorded during that first descent would be classified at the highest level and shown to maybe 30 people total, including the President and the Secretary of Defense. I watched that footage in a secure facility at Naval Base San Diego with 5 other officers, none of us speaking as the video played, showing us something that shattered decades of scientific consensus about human prehistory. The structure was enormous, easily the size of a large sports stadium, rising about 200 feet from the ocean floor, with walls that appeared to be made from some kind of metallic alloy, covered with what looked like barnacles and deep-sea organisms, but still clearly showing artificial construction beneath the biological growth. The architecture was unlike anything in human history, not Egyptian or Roman or Asian or any civilization we had records of. It had qualities that seemed almost organic despite being clearly manufactured, with flowing curves that transitioned into sharp geometric angles, patterns that repeated at different scales, suggesting fractal mathematics, and a kind of aesthetic sensibility that was simultaneously beautiful and alien. There were no windows or obvious entrances that we could see from the exterior, just smooth walls covered in symbols or writing in a script that looked vaguely similar to ancient Sumerian cuneiform, but far more complex and systematic. The Navy immediately established a classified research program codenamed Deep Echo, bringing in oceanographers, archaeologists, linguists, and material scientists who were all required to sign NDAs and work under military security protocols. I was assigned as the military liaison and operational commander, responsible for coordinating the research teams and managing the submersible operations that would attempt to explore the structure more thoroughly. We spent 6 months just documenting the exterior, creating detailed maps and taking samples of the wall material that preliminary analysis showed contained elements in ratios that didn't match any known natural or human-made alloys. The metal had properties that seemed impossible, conducting electricity at levels that should have required much higher temperatures, showing resistance to corrosion despite 50,000 years underwater, and having a crystalline structure at the molecular level that suggested manufacturing techniques far beyond our current capabilities. The breakthrough came when Dr. Sarah Nakamura, a linguist specializing in ancient writing systems, identified patterns in the symbols covering the walls that suggested they were mathematical rather than purely phonetic. She theorized that the script was using base 12 mathematics as a foundation, with each symbol representing complex mathematical relationships rather than individual sounds or words. Using this approach, she began decoding sections of the writing, and what she found was disturbing. The symbols appeared to be warnings, repeated in multiple locations around the structure, essentially saying that what was contained inside was dangerous and should remain sealed. Dr. Nakamura translated one section as roughly meaning, "Here lies what came before, preserved not as history, but as caution. Let the deep keep what the deep has claimed." Despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, the decision was made at the highest levels of government to attempt entry into the structure. We spent 3 more months searching for an entrance, finally locating what appeared to be a sealed doorway on the northern face of the building, marked with more of those warning symbols and what Dr. Nakamura identified as instructions for opening written in that mathematical script. The door mechanism still functioned after 50,000 years underwater, responding to a specific sequence of pressure applications that Dr. Nakamura had decoded from the instructions. When the door finally opened during a submersible operation I was commanding from the surface, I watched through the remote cameras as water rushed into the interior, which had apparently been sealed and airtight for millennia. The preservation of the interior space was remarkable, suggesting technologies for creating perfect seals that we still don't fully possess. The submersible entered slowly, its lights cutting through water that was cloudy with disturbed sediment, but gradually clearing to reveal an interior that looked more like a museum or archive than any kind of residence or military installation. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing what appeared to be artifacts or technology, perfectly preserved in some kind of transparent material that had protected them from decay and pressure. There were tools and devices whose purposes we couldn't immediately identify, objects that looked like art or religious items, and most significantly, there were pictographic displays covering entire walls, telling a story in images and symbols that Dr. Nakamura and her team would spend the next year trying to fully decode. What they eventually translated was a historical account that, if accurate, completely rewrote everything we thought we knew about the history of intelligent life on Earth. The pictographs told the story of a civilization that had existed on Earth approximately 55,000 to 50,000 years ago, long before the emergence of modern humans according to conventional timeline, though the beings depicted in the images appeared anatomically similar to humans, with some distinct differences in proportions and features. This civilization had been technologically advanced, possessing metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, and engineering capabilities that rivaled or exceeded our own in certain areas. They had built cities, developed writing and art, studied the natural world with scientific precision. But their civilization had been destroyed by what the pictographs depicted as a great catastrophe, massive environmental changes that the images showed as rising waters, volcanic eruptions, and climate shifts that made their previous territories uninhabitable. The survivors had constructed these archive structures in multiple locations around the world, sealing inside them examples of their technology and knowledge in hopes that whatever species inherited the Earth after them might find and learn from their example. If this story was accurate, it meant that intelligent technological civilization on Earth was not a recent development of the last 10,000 years, but had emerged, flourished, and been destroyed at least once before, leaving behind almost no trace except for these deliberately created archives placed in locations so remote and deep that they would survive any catastrophe that destroyed the civilization itself. It suggested that human history as we understood it was incomplete, that there were chapters written and erased by time and geological processes that we had no record of, and that modern humans might not be the first species on Earth to ask questions about the universe and our place in it. The implications were staggering from scientific, historical, and philosophical perspectives, but what we found deeper inside the structure was even more disturbing. As we explored further with multiple submersible operations, we discovered a section of the archive that appeared to be a preservation chamber, similar in concept to what we might call a museum or tomb. Inside transparent enclosures were the preserved bodies of several individuals from this ancient civilization, maintained in perfect condition by some process we still don't understand. They were humanoid, but distinctly not modern humans, with skeletal structures that showed subtle differences, cranial capacity that was significantly larger, and proportions that suggested adaptation to an environment or lifestyle very different from ours. DNA analysis of tissue samples showed they were definitely terrestrial, related to Earth's evolutionary tree, but branching off from the lineage that would eventually lead to modern humans at some point in the distant past we couldn't precisely determine. They weren't aliens from another planet. They were something perhaps more unsettling, a previous attempt at technological intelligence on Earth that had risen and fallen before humans ever existed. The most significant discovery came in what appeared to be a central chamber, a space clearly designed with ritual or ceremonial importance based on the elaborate decorations and the central placement of a single large device. This device was roughly cylindrical, about 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, made of that same impossible alloy as the walls, but covered in intricate patterns that Dr. Nakamura identified as being similar to the mathematical script, but far more complex. Embedded in the cylinder were what appeared to be crystalline structures that still emitted a faint luminescence even after 50,000 years, suggesting some kind of power source that had not depleted. Our best physicists studied the remote imaging and speculated it might be using principles of quantum mechanics that we were only beginning to understand theoretically, possibly zero-point energy or some other exotic physics that could provide essentially unlimited power from the quantum foam underlying space-time itself. We attempted to retrieve this device, spending 8 months developing specialized equipment that could survive the pressure at 36,000 feet and carefully extract the cylinder without damaging it. The operation was successful from a technical standpoint, and the device was brought to the surface and transported to a secure facility at Naval Base Point Loma in San Diego for study. But things began going wrong almost immediately in ways that made clear we had disturbed something we didn't understand and perhaps shouldn't have touched. Personnel working directly with the device began reporting strange experiences, vivid dreams that felt more like memories from lives they hadn't lived, moments of inexplicable knowledge about subjects they had never studied, and most disturbing, a persistent feeling of being watched or observed by something invisible and intelligent. Dr. Michael Torres, the lead physicist studying the device, suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological break after spending 72 consecutive hours running tests and refusing to leave the laboratory. When security finally forced entry to check on him, they found him sitting on the floor next to the device, weeping and speaking in a language that linguistic analysis identified as similar to the script from the underwater structure, but spoken rather than written. When he finally regained coherent speech in English, Dr. Torres claimed that the device had shown him things, transmitted information directly into his mind somehow, revealing the fate of the civilization that built it and warning that humanity was repeating their mistakes. He was immediately placed in psychiatric observation and eventually medically discharged, but 3 other researchers reported similar experiences before the program was shut down and the device sealed in containment.
If you've ever felt humanity might not be the first advanced civilization, share your thoughts in the comments. Before the program was terminated, I personally experienced something that convinced me Dr. Torres wasn't delusional or suffering a breakdown. I was in the containment facility late one night, alone, standing about 15 feet from the device while writing up security reports. I felt a sudden shift in awareness, like falling into a dream while still awake, and suddenly I was seeing images that weren't coming through my eyes, but appearing directly in my mind. I saw the world as it had been 50,000 years ago, cities built along coastlines that are now hundreds of feet underwater, beings that looked almost human but not quite, going about lives that were recognizably civilized, with families and commerce and art and all the things that make a culture. But I also saw their growing awareness that something was wrong, environmental changes happening faster than they could adapt to, oceans rising and temperatures shifting in ways that made their agricultural systems fail and their cities unsustainable. I saw their desperate attempts to preserve their knowledge and legacy, building these archive structures and sealing inside them everything they hoped might help whatever came after them avoid their fate. And I felt, more than saw, their understanding that what had destroyed them wasn't just natural climate change, but was partly caused by their own technological advancement, their manipulation of the environment in ways that triggered feedback loops they couldn't control or reverse. They had achieved so much, mastered so many aspects of nature, but hadn't developed the wisdom to use that mastery sustainably, and the result was civilization collapse on a scale that erased almost all evidence they had ever existed. The warning they left wasn't just historical record, but desperate plea across 50,000 years. Don't repeat our mistakes. Don't let technological capability outpace wisdom. Don't assume you can control systems you don't fully understand. The experience lasted maybe 5 minutes by objective time, but felt much longer subjectively. When it ended and I returned to normal awareness, I was shaking and drenched in sweat, despite the climate-controlled environment. I immediately reported what had happened, underwent medical and psychological evaluation, and was found to be physically healthy, but definitely affected by whatever the device did to consciousness. The decision was made at that point to seal the entire project, move the device to deep storage at an undisclosed location, classify all findings at the highest level, and basically pretend the discovery had never happened. The official explanation given to the few people who knew about Deep Echo was that the structure had been determined to be a natural formation with coincidental geometric qualities, and that the artifacts recovered were contaminated and scientifically worthless. Almost everyone involved was reassigned to other projects or encouraged to retire, with myself being among the latter. I've spent the 5 years since retirement trying to understand what I experienced and what it means for humanity's current trajectory. The parallels between that ancient civilization and our own are terrifying. They had achieved technological sophistication that in some ways exceeded ours. They had modified their environment extensively for their benefit. They had grown in population and consumption to global scale, and they had apparently been so confident in their ability to manage the systems they depended on that they didn't recognize the warnings until collapse was unavoidable. We're following the same pattern, modifying global climate through fossil fuel emissions, depleting resources faster than they can regenerate, developing technologies with transformative power but uncertain long-term consequences, all while assuming that our intelligence and capability will let us solve any problems that arise before they become catastrophic.
The device that transmitted those images to me and to others who worked with it wasn't just showing us historical information. It was trying to communicate urgency, trying to make us feel the weight of responsibility that comes with technological power, trying to warn us that intelligence alone isn't enough to ensure survival if it's not balanced by wisdom and restraint. That ancient civilization had been intelligent, clearly as smart as we are, or smarter based on some of their accomplishments, but intelligence without wisdom, capability without ethical foundation, power without understanding of consequences, those combinations had led them to inadvertently destroy the ecological systems their civilization depended on. And now we're doing the same thing, following the same trajectory, seemingly unable to learn from warnings even when they're spelled out for us by those who lived through exactly what we're risking. The Navy's decision to classify and bury this discovery is understandable from a certain perspective. If the public knew that advanced civilization had existed on Earth 50,000 years ago and destroyed itself through environmental catastrophe, the psychological and social implications would be destabilizing. It would force rewriting of human prehistory, challenging religious narratives about human uniqueness and recent creation. It would raise uncomfortable questions about whether our current civilization is also temporary and potentially self-destructing. It would suggest that the Fermi paradox, the question of why we don't see evidence of other technological civilizations in the cosmos, might have a dark answer, that technological species tend to destroy themselves before achieving interstellar capability. These aren't conclusions that governments want populations contemplating, especially when our economic systems depend on continued growth and consumption that might be unsustainable long-term. But I believe the public deserves to know, deserves to understand that we're not the first to walk this path, and that those who walked it before us didn't survive the journey. The archive structure in the Mariana Trench isn't alone. Based on the pictographs and the mathematical coordinates encoded in various sections of the structure, we believe there are at least 7 other similar archives located in deep ocean trenches around the world, each presumably containing similar warnings and historical records. Several nations with deep-sea capability have likely discovered some of these by now and made the same decision we did, to classify and hide what they found rather than share knowledge that might benefit all humanity. National security concerns and competitive advantage take precedence over collective survival, the same kind of short-term thinking that probably contributed to the collapse of that ancient civilization. What haunts me most is thinking about those final generations of that previous civilization, the ones who were born into a world already in decline, who grew up watching their environment destabilize and their society fracture under resource pressures, who knew their way of life was ending but couldn't stop the momentum of collapse. They must have felt helpless, watching their leaders make decisions that prioritized immediate concerns over long-term survival, watching their fellow citizens deny uncomfortable realities because facing them required lifestyle changes they didn't want to make. They must have wondered if their distant ancestors, who built the first cities and developed the first technologies, could have foreseen where that path would lead, and if knowing would have made any difference. Those final generations tried to leave messages for whoever came after, spending precious resources to build these archives instead of trying to save themselves, hoping that maybe the next intelligent species wouldn't repeat their mistakes. I'm sharing this now, risking prosecution and imprisonment, because I believe we're running out of time to change course. The warning signs are everywhere: rising global temperatures, increasing extreme weather events, ecosystem collapses, resource depletion, the same pattern that destroyed that previous civilization playing out again in front of us. We have advantages they didn't: global communication systems that let us coordinate response, scientific understanding of climate and ecological systems that they probably lacked, and most importantly, we have their example as warning
warning, but we're not using these advantages effectively, still operating under assumptions that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet, that technology will solve problems faster than we create new ones, that someone else or future generations will handle the consequences of our current decisions.
The beings who built that archive structure tried to warn us across 50,000 years. The device they left behind wasn't just technology, but a message delivery system designed to transmit understanding directly to consciousness in ways that words and pictures couldn't fully convey. They wanted whoever found their ruins to not just know intellectually what happened to them, but to feel it, to understand viscerally what civilization collapse means for actual living beings experiencing it. I felt that during my brief contact with the device, felt the desperation and regret of a species that had achieved so much but lost everything through inability to recognize limits and live sustainably within them. That feeling stays with me, driving me to speak out, even though I know most people won't believe what I'm saying, and those in power would prefer I stayed silent. The structure is still down there, 36,000 feet below the Pacific, sealed again after we retrieved the device and some artifacts. The Navy positioned it as a contaminated site that shouldn't be approached, ensuring no other nations would attempt exploration. But the knowledge contained in that archive, the warnings written on those walls, the story told in those pictographs, that information should be shared with all humanity rather than hidden by military classification. We deserve to know our planet's true history, to understand that we're not the first technological species it has hosted, and to learn from the fate of those who came before us. Maybe that knowledge would motivate the kind of fundamental changes to our economic and social systems that sustainable survival requires. Maybe it wouldn't, but keeping it secret guarantees we'll repeat their mistakes out of ignorance, rather than at least having the choice to act differently with full information. I don't know what will happen to me for speaking out. I've consulted with lawyers who specialize in whistleblower cases, and they're not optimistic about my legal position given the classification levels involved and the fact that I signed agreements acknowledging I could be detained indefinitely for revealing this information. I might spend my remaining years in federal prison. But I'm 61 years old. My wife passed away 3 years ago, my children are grown and independent, and I've decided that whatever time I have left needs to be spent trying to prevent humanity from following that ancient civilization into extinction. If my testimony makes even a few people think differently about our relationship with the planet and our responsibility to future generations, if it contributes in some small way to the cultural shift we need to survive this century, then whatever consequences I face will be worthwhile. The most disturbing aspect of the entire Deep Echo project was how many intelligent, educated people saw the evidence and understood the implications, but decided that protecting the secret was more important than warning humanity. We had scientists who believed the findings, military officers who grasped the strategic significance, government officials who understood the historical importance, all agreeing that this information should be buried rather than shared. The reasoning was always some variation of people aren't ready to know, or it would cause panic, or our adversaries would exploit the knowledge. But those justifications amount to deciding that elite groups should make decisions for all humanity about information that affects our collective survival. The same kind of centralized control thinking that probably contributed to that ancient civilization's inability to respond effectively to their crisis.
I hope I'm wrong about the parallels I'm drawing between our situation and theirs. I hope our technology and global cooperation and scientific understanding give us capabilities they lacked that will let us navigate challenges they couldn't survive. I hope the warnings they left will actually make a difference in our choices rather than being ignored or dismissed as classified nonsense from a crazy retired naval officer. But hope isn't a strategy. and waiting for someone else to solve existential problems has never worked in history. We need to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about our current trajectory, make difficult changes to systems that aren't sustainable long-term, and prioritize survival over comfort or profit or national advantage. The beings who built that archive tried to tell us this across millennia. The question is whether we're capable of listening and acting on wisdom from those who learned these lessons through their own civilization's collapse. What we found 36,000 feet below the Pacific wasn't just ruins of a forgotten civilization. It was a mirror showing us our potential future, a warning carved in metal and stone and encoded in devices that still function after 50,000 years, left by beings who achieved greatness and lost everything through inability to live sustainably. They were intelligent like us, curious like us, ambitious like us, and they're gone now, remembered only in archives built to survive them. We have the chance to make different choices, to learn from their example, to build a civilization that doesn't just achieve technological sophistication, but develops the wisdom to maintain it long-term. Whether we'll actually do that remains to be seen. But we can't make better choices if we don't know the full stakes of the decisions we're facing, and that's why I'm risking everything to share what I learned in the deepest part of the ocean, where our predecessors left their final testament.